While recently discussing the problems that Disney has faced in their animation department, I always keep finding myself looking back on something more heinous that the company has recently produced, and that is the live-action adaptations, where finally the first trailer of The Little Mermaid was fully released and it does not look visually good in the slightest, but will be one of the most popular movies of this year in terms of box office. And that got me a little bit angry thinking back on this genre as a whole and what it means to really degrade the quality of the animated films. How the point of animation is a medium rather than a genre that you could use to recreate films to bank off of the nostalgia rather than create an entertaining story. That's not to say they can't be good, but there is something just totally wrong about any live action adaptations, whether it become from Disney or even like Netflix regarding the case of their live action anime adaptations. Things like Cowboy Bebop or the upcoming Yu Yu Hakusho. Detestable material even by my standards when I don't even watch anime or any of their adaptations by what I've seen. Where the real point remains is that the reason these types of stories work is that they are animated and how their cultural values and our ideas can only be portrayed in this fashion in the form of animation, whereas when they try to adapt it to another screen, it usually doesn't work. But of course, in the cases of some stories like Disney has done that have been adapted by several works of literature and such, there can be cases where it can be told in that form what stories they have, but there is also something distinctly wrong where they just remove the point of having the animation to tell us an interesting story, where the live action just lacks what made that special to begin with. The biggest driving factor for these movies' success is the fact that it banks off of your nostalgia and nothing more, either following a story beat for beat like the original in the cases of Lion King and Beauty and the Beast, or attempting to do something different in the cases of Cinderella and Mulan. Which, of course, Cinderella was the only one that has really worked so far, where although they can innovate in such cases, they also prove us wrong in the cases of like what Mulan did to remove anything that people loved about the films in the first place. It also doesn't make sense for any of these films to do the color swapping of characters like Ariel or Tinkerbell, to use to differentiate the versions as unique, where it just acts as disingenuous by using diversity for profit and attention rather than creating an interesting story that takes away from what made the original special to begin with. And of course, it also lacks any creativity to tell a unique story of a newer character that can represent anyone without having to use a worn out template to make an easy profit off of. Of course, not only that, it makes it easier to label any detractors from the project as racist and such for not agreeing with the decision when you're basically just using race as the point of attraction for a 30-year-old product that you slapped a new coat of paint on. Where I hardly understand the point of this, where I've enjoyed such a diverse stories from Disney within their animated movies, where if that was truly the case, you might as well have cast an Indian as Mulan to disrespect the culture of that movie story because you could do something as stupid as this. It just doesn't make any sense at all. They just have no real purpose other than to satisfy your own childhood memories of that particular movie and nothing else, where Disney has signified how they are no longer capable of making any new live-action original property unless it comes from like Marvel remaking animated films, theme park adaptations, and of course everything the grain that doesn't involve them to actually think. Of course, this topic doesn't necessarily apply to live action in this case, because I will once again mention my most despised movie of all time being that of The Lion King 2019, where no matter what video I make on Disney, I will always bring this up to solidify my point in cases against these films because of the fact that this is not live action at all, even though it tries to bill it as such, where everything we see is completely CGI. In a nutshell, this is an animated film where they would actually like it to be counted as live action, but it really is not. It is actually the literal definition as a remake in all of its aspects, improving technologically to just portray the film as real. It's just a movie that tries to redefine animation as a genre and not as a medium because they wanted to make this even though nobody on that screen actually exists. They are not using real animals because they need them to talk, and the fact that they needed them to portray the same events that happened in the original movie, which both cannot work. And it's still a fact that upsets me today that the world was so willing to watch this movie because of how much it made at the box office, because at this point, it still remains the 9th highest grossing film of all time for a story that was only released 24 years prior, and one that removes everything that made the original film enjoyable to begin with. Because when you portray something as real, you have to be as accurate as possible to make the audience believe like you were actually watching a documentary on animals that can talk and sing, which of course doesn't work because of how expressionless they all feel. Because how can you connect with a lion who can barely make more than 2 expressions with his face when he sings any of the songs? It's something that just doesn't work in the case of what animation provides, that takes the animal element and combines it with human expression so that people can actually connect more with that experience and see what the characters actually go through. No one really goes to this movie because they are interested in the story they have to tell because they already saw it. They are only interested in it because of the fact that they loved it as a kid and want to see what interesting things that they could do in this form, which is in fact completely nothing. Because if you had a movie that can embody the word pointless, this would actually be it. It's literally the same thing with the same music, the same composer, one of the same actors, where the only real difference here is they recasted the entire cast that isn't James Earl Jones and the fact that it is quote-unquote real. And to be honest, you would have been better off watching a Disney nature documentary that provides you with real animals rather than watching something that pretends to be it is while using something that was already popular and already enjoyed upon. There's literally nothing interesting about having these creatures sing when they just move like real animals compared to the first where they're actually swaying to the beat and dancing, all for the sake of realism that doesn't even exist on the screen, where no matter how good Donald Glover is at singing in this moment, you don't really feel like Simba is actually doing that at all. It just is so stupid. And it's also in the same case of the actual live action films like Beauty and the Beast, where Emma Watson's performance as Belle is so derivative of any emotions that Belle had in the original film, from the singing to the emotional acting, and of course the obligatory CGI characters of the Beast's castle. Because in still portraying these things as real, they have to remove everything special and unique about what made those characters alive and believable as humans turned into furniture or other objects. You take one look at characters like Cogsworth here, and you just see a clock who's moving around compared to the one who actually had emotions and feelings such as a human would have. This is also the same case as what you see with Lumiere, where he has this tiny face that you can barely see compared to the actual candlestick that had big ass eyes and expressions that truly made his character special to begin with. And all of the expressions are what make this movie special, whether it be from the talking clocks or the humans who like Gaston, where they actually love to actually exaggerate how manly and buff he was, where now he's just a regular strong handsome man who could do a bunch of stuff. You just can't find any way to justify that this was a good movie when it already proved how much that they could do to tell the story to begin with. You can't make someone like Luke Evans eat 4 dozen eggs in this scene because it isn't possible. You can't emphasize Gaston's biceps like this in real life while he lifts a bench with 3 girls on it because that's improbable. It's just that you cannot do anything you had from the original because it's not supposed to be real. But of course, not everything has to be like that, like the films they portray. They can still tell their own separate real stories to begin with to have an entertaining fun time for the audience, but the point of these films is the fact that they were animated to begin with to convey this, and you just want to make this to tell a story in a different way because it's all a genre to you to make money off of us. I mean, of course you might praise Will Smith's Genie for taking it in a different direction and having the film do creative things from the original, but everyone who loves Genie loves him because of what Robin Williams brought to his character with his different impressions, something that Will Smith can't clearly do with his character of Genie because the character of Genie does not feel real with what we begin with. Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King are all films of this type that follow the same story and do nothing different except with the addition of a new song and a realistic approach to the story, not adding too much but just enough that satisfies the audience for their cherished memories and nothing more, banking off the huge success of the Disney Renaissance era, one of the best eras for Disney animation, and it's not hard to see why they would do any of this. But that comes at the cost of other films like Mulan, as we'll see. Because in the case of Mulan, it is one of the films that tries to be different from the others that follow their same story and actually tries to take a unique, mature spin on it. But the problem with this was in fact everything. Not only do they try to spin the movie in a different direction from the beaten path of the original Mulan, they removed the entire soul from the film in a similar vein to how the expressions of The Lion King were totally removed. Nothing in this film made any sense in the vein of making Mulan more of this superhero type where Disney was also trying to appeal to the Chinese market but failing in the most spectacular way possible where they even hate it as much as we do. It's one that lacks any respect for anything it tries to attempt to do, either on adapting the original film or trying to appeal to that Chinese culture, where they actually had to remove anything to do with either of those two, all the while having the controversy of filming in a region where the Chinese government is oppressing people, because Disney cares more about appeasing that government to just make more profit off of that country instead of telling an actual story. Because of course, for the sake of this movie, let's just put in a dumbass witch who serves the bad guys but switches because Mulan sees her as an equal rather than a puppet, serving as a character in places like Mushu, who is an important aspect of the film in scenes like this.
Citizens, I need firepower.
Who are you?
Your worst nightmare.
And scenes like this is something you cannot get out of this shit adaptation because it has heart in it, where this real film does not have any of that, removing him and Li Shang for some crap reasons because of the Me Too movement stating that it was truly uncomfortable for them to have a love interest for Mulan, despite the backlash they caused that stated he was actually a bisexual icon who had feelings for Mulan before she was outed as a female, where he in that very film actually respected her as a soldier before solidifying any feelings for her that were noted at the end of the very film after that very war, all of which doesn't include any of the stupid bullshit reasons those entitled assholes ever thought in their corporate minds to appease a movement that has been abused beyond meaning of any sense or rationality. And of course, also giving Mulan powers removes any point that the original was trying to tell about a woman proving how much that she can be worthy in any field that a man can do, and also bringing honor to her family and all of her nation, where by doing this action of explaining this power of chi or whatever in this film, you just cheapen that to become a shell of its former self. Mulan isn't special anymore, she's already gifted with this talent, and it doesn't give any meaning to that very story anymore. This movie is a personification of nothing being portrayed as something. I mean, what is the point of removing all these things that made the animated film impactful with paying homage to the culture to begin with if you can't actually tell an interesting story to go along with it? At this point, you're actually better off getting a more authentic experience by listening to the original Mulan in either Mandarin or Cantonese, because at least you get to experience the songs in Chinese, and Li Shang is actually played by Jackie Chan, so that's a plus. It's just that the more they keep doing it, the more worse it gets, just removing what we, the producers, didn't like about the original elements of the film in favor of something more modern and soulless that has no value and is continuing in cases of movies today, especially in the latest trailers for Peter Pan and The Little Mermaid. And to point out films like Peter Pan coming out, I just noticed that Disney is releasing these on Disney Plus, where you've noticed for the most part like Peter Pan and all the other older films that came out during Walt Disney's time are actually being released on that platform, where the newer ones are being released theatrically, all except in the cases of Maleficent and Cinderella, where Disney Plus did not exist yet, or they just feel like in these cases audiences wouldn't respond well to it because it hasn't been something that has been more fresh in the minds of young adults today, which is honestly more of a sheer lack of respect for these films because they think they are just too old. The act of not letting the theater going public to see any of this is actually shameful, to only produce mediocre new content to keep people watching your streaming service instead, where the films themselves lack any respect for their original adaptations in almost all regards, with Pinocchio being the biggest example where, just like Mulan, they actually remove all the traits that made his story special to begin with his struggles to be a good boy through temptations of certain things, and actually in this film made him holier than thou who wouldn't even drink root beer of all things, whereas original character did things like literally drink alcoholic beer and smoked cigarettes, where the message of that very film were to teach him how these things were actually bad things in society that were going to eventually turn him into a donkey. Whereas in this film's case, they don't want to be brave at all, censoring things like the word jackass when it was on full display for everyone in the original, but leads us to something way worse with Peter Pan actually coming up, where it seems like everyone online is actually hating this. Even the people who are praising The Little Mermaid consider this shit is weak as hell, because this is the trailer that described everything wrong with these films as of today, where they're turning things like The Lost Boys into The Lost Boys and Girls Club, something I already discussed before in this very video, where they are actually removing the message that the original play was trying to represent, and how it actually is supposed to portray girls like Wendy as more mature figures against boys who are more susceptible to these things that caused them to be lost in the first place. It's just so amazing how shallow their attempts at diversity are truly getting to change the stories that have already been done instead of adapting something that hasn't been done before, because that requires too much effort for some reason. You don't really care about these stories, you care more about your pocketbooks being filled, banking off of the creativity that this company once had 20 years ago, decimating all of that under the guise of improved technology to retell these stories from ever having to innovate in this industry ever again. And this leads us back to today with The Little Mermaid, which actually points to signs repeating the era of The Lion King, Aladdin, and Beauty and the Beast, with a group of people who loved it to recapture something they already saw 2 decades ago. And the problem with this is of course not because of Ariel is black. I don't really care about that. The real thing I actually care about is how they're actually using her in this way to promote the film. Instead of providing us with a new diverse range of stories, they're just using older ones that were mostly known specifically in this way, where she was a redhead, and now using that to switch it up to promote a new diverse story that is actually more lazy, shameful, and exploitative in all of its aspects. I mean, that's not to take away anything to the people who do enjoy this and like this, because if you do, that's good. You should just do whatever makes you feel happy. But please, for the sake of creativity, watch something else that doesn't really destroy the whole point of the movies to begin with animation as a medium rather than a genre. Where if you look at this trailer, it looks more jarring and fake compared to the 1989 classic for some reason. I mean, what the fuck is that Sebastian? Did they just literally make him into a ghost crab because that kind of animal cannot breathe underwater? And I'm pretty sure this is a character who lives under the water who also sings a song called Under the Sea. Disney? Did you ever think about that? But anyways, you do get my point about no matter how great any of these films could be, it just feels like the entire production direction of all of Disney's live action films remove any of the expressions that made the animals work well in animation or the story as a whole with these characters to begin with, where people will just keep eating it all up because their favorite character is there. I mean, I will watch and see what they do with the characters, and I'm pretty sure she'll be phenomenal in the role of Ariel, but I'm just so tired of them using this crap to sell as content to the general public. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see to find out what happens to this movie, where there is a possibility of that being good. And that's actually okay if they actually manage to have some good story to go with it, but it still ultimately reflects on the lack of doing anything new to tell in their stories, where they just keep going on with a more realistic approach to something that already been done before, and will keep doing it until every film is covered. With that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.